The wind screamed across the Wyoming plains like a dying animal, each gust driving needles of ice through Margaret Chen's threadbare coat. She couldn't see more than 3 feet ahead. The world had become nothing but white fury and cold that burned worse than fire. The stagecoach was gone. She'd heard the driver's voice 30 seconds ago, maybe a minute, harsh and practical as he'd called out his final words. "Ain't my job to freeze for mail-order mistakes, lady. Whitmore's ranch is 8 miles that direction. Walk or die makes no difference to me." Then the crack of reins, the protest of wheels finding purchase in deep snow, and silence, except for the wind's endless howl. Margaret stood alone in the blizzard, 26 years old, with 83 cents in her worn leather bag and the certain knowledge that she would die here if she didn't move. The thought came with strange clarity, cutting through the panic like a blade through silk. She had perhaps an hour, maybe less. Already she couldn't feel her toes, and the cold was creeping up her legs with patient inevitability. Her fingers found the fence post she'd been gripping. Wood, rough and solid. Real. The driver had said to follow the fence line, hadn't he? Or had she imagined that? The cold made thinking difficult, made everything distant and dreamlike. No. Focus. She'd survived worse than this. The factory fires in Boston, when the looms caught, and 3 girls died in the smoke. Her mother's final winter, when pneumonia hollowed her out until nothing remained but a ghost in a narrow bed. Her stepmother's cruelty, calculated and precise as clockwork. Margaret had survived all of it by being practical, by doing what needed to be done, no matter how it hurt. She wrapped her left hand around the fence wire, felt the bite of frozen metal even through her glove, started walking. 1 foot, then the other. The wire would lead somewhere, had to lead somewhere. Fences didn't exist in emptiness. They marked boundaries, enclosed spaces, protected something worth protecting. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd come west to escape boundaries, to find a place where a woman could exist as more than ornament or servant. And here she was, clutching a fence like a lifeline, wholly dependent on the very thing she'd fled. Her mother's voice drifted through her mind, soft and defeated as it had been near the end. "You're too clever for your own good, Margaret. Men don't want clever wives. They want quiet ones, soft ones. Learn to be small, or you'll die alone." "Well, Mother," Margaret thought with bitter humor, "you were half right. I'm dying. But I refused to be small." 3 days ago she'd been warm and dry in Edgar Whitmore's ranch house, reviewing his ledgers while he watched with growing irritation. The numbers had been wrong, obviously, glaringly wrong. She'd pointed it out with what she'd thought was helpful discretion. "Mr. Whitmore, you've miscalculated the feed costs. You're paying 12% more than necessary. If you adjust the orders to account for bulk pricing and eliminate this middleman here, you'd save nearly $90 per quarter." His face had gone red, then white. The transformation had been fascinating in its swiftness, like watching storm clouds gather on a summer horizon. "Woman who corrects my ledgers ain't wife material, Miss Chen. I need someone who knows her place, not some uppity Boston girl who thinks she's smarter than her betters." The memory stung worse than the cold. She'd crossed half a continent for this, staked everything on the promise in Abigail Porter's careful letters. "A good man," Mrs. Porter had written in her precise script. "Established rancher, looking for a wife with some education to help manage his household affairs. Perfect for a young woman of your capabilities, Miss Chen. I believe you and Mr. Whitmore will suit each other admirably." What Mrs. Porter hadn't mentioned was that Edgar Whitmore's idea of managing household affairs meant keeping her mouth shut while he ran his ranch into the ground through sheer mathematical incompetence. That his notion of an educated wife extended only as far as someone who could read his correspondence aloud to him, not someone who might actually understand what the numbers meant. By morning, she'd been back on the stagecoach with her single bag and a telegram to Abigail Porter explaining the situation. The driver had been sympathetic at first, offering her hardtack and cold coffee, explaining that there were other ranchers on Mrs. Porter's list. other possibilities. Whitmore was difficult, he'd said, particular. The fourth bride to reject him, or be rejected by him depending on who was telling the story. That sympathy had lasted until the blizzard hit. Margaret's foot caught on something hidden beneath the snow. She fell hard, her grip on the fence wire torn away. For a moment she lay there, the wind stealing her breath, snow finding every gap in her clothing, every weakness in her defenses. This was how it would end then. Frozen in a place whose name she didn't even know, rejected by a man whose books she could have salvaged, mourned by no one who mattered. The rage that thought kindled was enough to get her moving again. She would not die proving her stepmother right, would not vanish into the storm, as if her 26 years had meant nothing, as if the brilliance she'd inherited from her mother and spent a lifetime cultivating was worth no more than the snow already covering her tracks. Her hand found the wire again. She pulled herself up, legs shaking, body protesting every movement, continued walking. Time became meaningless. There was only the fence, the wire cutting through her glove now, drawing blood that froze instantly. The warm wetness that might be blood or might be her body's last desperate attempt to keep her fingers functioning. The cold had moved past pain into a distant numbness that was almost peaceful, almost welcoming. Her thoughts drifted, untethered from present urgency. She thought of her mother's ledger, the one Margaret had found after the funeral, a small leather book hidden in the lining of an old trunk, tucked beneath yellowed letters and faded photographs, filled with careful notations in her mother's elegant hand. Not household accounts, though those were there too. Something else, something secret, observations, mathematical patterns in nature, calculations of stellar movements, poetry rendered as equations, beauty translated into numbers that made sense to her mother in ways that words never quite could. The secret life of Marianne Chen, mathematician and dreamer, reduced to stolen moments and hidden pages because Margaret's father believed women's minds weren't suited for such pursuits. That intellectual exertion would damage their delicate constitutions, render them unsuitable for the duties of wife and mother. Her mother had died at 42, worn down by decades of pretending to be less than she was, of hiding her brilliance like a shameful secret, of channeling her formidable intelligence into household management and social graces that utilized perhaps a tenth of her actual capability. Margaret had sworn at that graveside, fresh earth, dark against spring snow, that she would never make the same choice, would never shrink herself to fit someone else's expectations, even if it meant dying alone and unmourned, would never spend her life pretending that managing a household budget was the full extent of her mathematical ability when she could calculate compound interest in her head and spot accounting fraud at a glance. Though she'd rather hoped dying would wait a few more decades, would arrive after she'd accomplished something, built something, proved something to someone. The wind shifted, and through its howl she heard something else, a voice, distant, barely audible, over the storm's rage, but unmistakably human. "Follow the fence line. Keep your hand on the wire." Margaret tried to call back, but her throat was too frozen, her voice lost in the wind's roar. She kept walking, following the wire with single-minded focus, her entire world narrowed to the next step, the next grip, the next moment of survival. The voice came again, closer now, cutting through the white chaos with the clarity of a church bell. "I see you! Don't stop! Follow my voice!" She couldn't see him yet, couldn't see anything but the endless white and the fence wire that was her only connection to the possibility of continued existence. But the voice was male, steady and sure, in a way that cut through her panic like warmth through ice. She stumbled forward, still gripping the wire, her other hand outstretched toward the sound like a drowning woman reaching for a rope. Then he was there, a dark shape materializing from the white like something conjured from desperation and prayer. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face hidden behind a snow-crusted scarf, and the wide brim of a hat weighted down with accumulated ice. Only his eyes were visible, gray-blue and startlingly clear, the color of winter sky just before dawn. "You're the mail-order bride," he said. Not a question, a statement of fact, delivered with the same certainty he might use to identify the weather or the time of day. "For Whitmore, he's 8 miles east. This is my ranch." "He doesn't want me," Margaret managed, her words slurred by cold and stiff lips that could barely form the shapes of speech. "Coach left me. Driver took my money and left me." The gray-blue eyes studied her for a long moment. She could see him making calculations behind them, weighing options, determining courses of action. Then, without another word, without asking permission or offering explanation, he swept her up off her feet as if she weighed nothing at all. Through the layers of wool and leather she could feel the warmth of him, the solid reality of another human being after what felt like hours of being the only living thing in a dead world. She wanted to protest, to insist she could walk, to maintain some shred of dignity and independence. But the words wouldn't come, and she wasn't certain she could walk even if she wanted to. "Hold on," he said, and there was something in his voice, some quality she couldn't name through the fog of cold and exhaustion. Promise, maybe, or simple statement of fact. "I've got you." He turned, carrying her into the storm with the confidence of a man who knew exactly where he was going, even when visibility extended no further than his own boots. Margaret tried to see where they were headed, but the snow made everything impossible, reduced the world to abstract shapes and the steady rhythm of his stride. She gave up and let her head rest against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath the thick coat, using it as an anchor against the storm's chaos. They'd been walking for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, when a structure emerged from the white. A cabin, low and solid, built from thick logs that had weathered to the color of old bones. Smoke rose from a stone chimney only to be immediately scattered by the wind. The sight of it, warm and real and promising shelter, made something in Margaret's chest loosen just enough to let her breathe. He kicked the door open, and warmth flooded out, so intense after the cold that it hurt like a physical blow. The cabin's interior was dim, lit by a banked fire in a massive stone hearth that dominated one wall. He set her down in a chair near the fire with surprising gentleness for such a large man, immediately beginning to work at the buttons of her coat with practiced efficiency. "Can you feel your fingers?" His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, carrying no more emotion than if he were asking her preference for coffee. Not unkind, but not gentle either. The voice of someone dealing with a problem that needed solving, a situation requiring specific interventions in a specific order. Margaret tried to wiggle her fingers. The left hand responded sluggishly, pins and needles suggesting circulation still functioned. The right didn't respond at all. Just dead weight at the end of her arm, as unresponsive as carved wood. Left hand, barely. He swore quietly, a single sharp word that suggested he'd dealt with this before and knew exactly what it meant. Pulled off her gloves with careful efficiency. Her right hand was white, the fingers stiff and unnatural-looking, the skin waxy in a way that made her stomach turn. Frostbite. She'd seen it before in Boston, knew what it meant if not treated properly and quickly. She might lose the fingers, might lose the whole hand if the damage went deep enough. "This will hurt," he said, and brought her hands to his mouth, breathing warm air across the frozen skin with steady patience. He was right. It hurt worse than anything she'd felt in the storm, worse than the initial cold, or the endless walking, or the despair of thinking she would die alone in the white. As sensation returned to her fingers, it brought with it a burning agony that made her gasp, made her want to pull away, made her bite down on her lip, hard enough to taste blood just to keep from crying out. He kept breathing on her hands, patient and methodical, then tucked them against his neck where his skin was warm and slightly rough with stubble. The intimacy of it should have been shocking, should have made her protest. But all she could focus on was the warmth, the return of feeling, the promise that she might keep her fingers after all. Keep them there. Don't pull away no matter how much it hurts. His neck was warm, the pulse steady beneath her frozen fingers. She could feel the life in him, the heat and blood and beating heart that meant survival. Slowly, agonizingly, feeling crept back into her hands. The pain was intense, but manageable. She'd learned pain management in the factories, where small injuries were constant and complaint was weakness, where showing hurt meant being seen as unsuitable for the work. While he held her hands against his neck, he worked at her boots with his free hand, pulling them off with gentle competence that suggested experience with this particular emergency. Her feet were in better shape than her hands, still pink, though painfully cold. He wrapped them in a thick wool blanket and set them on a stool near the fire, positioning them for maximum warmth without risk of burning. "You'll live," he said, releasing her hands and standing, "though you came damn close to doing otherwise. Another 20 minutes in that storm, and we'd be having a different conversation, or no conversation at all." Now that her eyes had adjusted to the interior light, Margaret could see him properly for the first time. He was perhaps 35, though the weathering of his face made age difficult to determine with precision. Tall, 6 feet and change, with dark hair going gray at the temples in a way that suggested either premature aging or harder living than most men experienced. His eyes were the color of winter sky, pale gray blue that looked almost silver in the firelight. Strong jaw, straight nose, a mouth that looked like it didn't smile often, but might be capable of it under the right circumstances. Handsome, in a severe sort of way, like a mountain was handsome, all hard planes and uncompromising angles. More importantly, competent, everything about him, from the way he'd carried her through the storm to the efficiency with which he'd treated her frostbite, spoke of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and didn't waste time or motion on unnecessary flourishes. "Thank you," Margaret said. Her voice came out rougher than she'd intended, scraped raw by cold and fear and relief, all tangled together. "You saved my life." "Couldn't do much else. Letting you freeze would have been poor hospitality." He moved to the stove, an impressive cast-iron piece that dominated one corner of the cabin, and began making something that filled the space with the smell of coffee, rich and bitter and real. "You're the fourth one." "Fourth what?" "Fourth mail-order bride meant for Whitmore. First 3 didn't last either. Man's got no sense when it comes to women, got plenty of other faults too, but that's the one that keeps costing him wives." He poured coffee into 2 tin cups, added sugar to both without asking if she wanted it, and brought one to her with the same efficient care he'd shown in everything else. "Drink, slow. Your stomach's not ready for fast." The coffee was strong enough to strip paint and sweet enough to make her teeth ache, but it was hot, and that was all that mattered. Margaret wrapped both hands around the cup, still feeling the pins and needles of returning circulation, and let the warmth seep into her still aching fingers. "He said I wasn't wife material because I corrected his ledgers." The man snorted, a sound of pure derision that suggested he had strong opinions about Edgar Whitmore and his ledgers. "Whitmore couldn't balance a ledger if his life depended on it. Last I heard he was $300 in debt because he can't calculate feed costs properly and won't admit he needs help. Pride's expensive when you're that stupid." He settled into the chair opposite hers, cradling his own coffee with hands that dwarfed the tin cup. "You any good with numbers?" "I managed accounts for Boston Textile Mill. 47 suppliers, $12,000 monthly receipts. Inventory tracking for 6,000 individual items across 3 floors of production. I ran the entire accounting department by the time I was 20. His eyes sharpened with interest, the gray-blue suddenly more blue than gray, catching light from the fire. "That's not small-time bookkeeping." "No, it's not. I started as a floor worker at 16. Looms and spindles, 12-hour shifts, hands bleeding from the work. But the foreman noticed I could calculate faster than the bookkeeper. Production rates, waste percentages, cost per unit. I could do it all in my head while the bookkeeper struggled with paper and pencil." She paused, taking another sip of the scalding coffee, feeling it burn all the way down. By 18, I was managing supplier contracts. By 20, I was running the entire accounting department. Saved the mill over $15,000 in my first year through better negotiations and waste reduction. Cut fraud by 30% by actually checking the numbers instead of trusting that everyone was honest. Why'd you leave? The question was direct, almost blunt. No social niceties softening the edges. But Margaret appreciated the honesty in it, the straightforward curiosity that didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. The mill closed. New ownership decided to consolidate operations in New York. They offered to take me with them, offered good wages and a position that would have used my skills. But my mother was dying and I couldn't leave her. Not then. Not when she had so little time left. Margaret stared into her coffee, watching steam rise and dissipate. After she passed, my father remarried within 6 months. Catherine Sullivan, daughter of his business partner, 28 years old, closer to my age than his. She made it abundantly clear she had no intention of sharing her new home with her husband's half-Chinese daughter. The words came easier than she'd expected, maybe because exhaustion had stripped away her normal guards, maybe because this stranger who'd saved her life seemed like the kind of man who would appreciate plain truth more than polite evasion. My stepmother gave me 1 month to find other accommodations, said my presence was undermining her authority as lady of the house, that the servants didn't respect her when I was there because they'd known me since childhood. My father was in New York on business when she delivered her ultimatum. By the time he returned, I'd already moved into the boarding house near the mill. Your father allowed this? There was something in his voice now, an edge that suggested he had opinions about fathers who let their daughters be cast out. My father believed Catherine's version of events. She told him I'd chosen to leave, that I was being difficult about accepting her as his wife, that I'd insulted her in front of the staff. He gave me $300 as a settlement and told me it was more than generous considering I was a grown woman who should be making her own way. The old anger stirred, familiar and useless as a broken compass. Said he hoped I'd use it wisely to find a husband, since I'd clearly demonstrated I had no talent for being a daughter. Those were his exact words. No talent for being a daughter. Sam's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes or false sympathy. Just listened with the same focused attention he'd brought to treating her frostbite. I used 200 of it to pay off my mother's medical debts. She'd accumulated them in her final year, and I couldn't bear to leave them unpaid. Spent another $70 on 6 months' rent at the boarding house. That left $30. I'd been saving from my mill wages, had another $40 put aside for emergencies. When the mill closed, I had $70 total and no prospects in Boston. She took a long drink of coffee, using the bitterness to ground herself. I tried finding similar work, applied to every business that might need an accountant or bookkeeper. Most wouldn't even see me because I was a woman. The ones that would interview me offered half what they'd pay a man for the same work and made it clear they expected me to be grateful for the opportunity. And you weren't grateful. No, I wasn't grateful for the chance to do twice the work for half the pay while pretending I was lucky to have it. Margaret met his eyes directly. Mrs. Porter's advertisement promised a fresh start, a chance to be useful rather than ornamental. I spent $50 on the journey west and the matchmaking fee. The remaining $20 I'd budgeted for establishing myself, buying appropriate clothing, making a good impression on my future husband. What happened to the other $19.17? Margaret almost smiled at the precision of the question, the automatic calculation. Of course he'd done the math, even while claiming he couldn't cipher. Edgar Whitmore happened. When he rejected me after 3 days, I paid the stagecoach driver the remainder to take me back to town. He assured me the weather would hold long enough to make the journey safely. He kept $17 and abandoned me in the storm the moment the first flakes started falling. Son of a bitch. The words were quiet but intense, carrying more anger than volume. Jake Morrison. Has to be. He's the only driver who works this route in winter. I'll be having words with him when the storm clears." "I'd rather you didn't. I can't afford to make enemies when I have nowhere to go and no money to get there." Margaret set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. "Which brings me to a rather awkward question. What happens now? You've saved my life, for which I'm profoundly grateful. But I can't stay here indefinitely, and I can't walk 8 miles to Whitmore's ranch even if he'd take me back, which he won't, and I can't afford passage back to town or anywhere else." Sam studied her in silence for a long moment, those winter eyes evaluating her with the same careful assessment he might give to a horse he was considering purchasing. Not cruel, not demeaning, just thoroughly practical. Finally he spoke. "I've been short a bookkeeper for 2 years, ever since my wife died. Been managing on my own, but I'm not good at it. Numbers don't come natural to me. I can ranch well enough. Can't cipher worth a damn." He paused, the words coming with visible effort, as if he was unused to asking for help. "Storm's going to last 3 days at least, maybe 4. By the time it clears, Whitmore will have moved on to some other arrangement. But I could use someone who knows their way around a ledger and isn't afraid of hard work." Margaret's hands had stopped shaking. The feeling had fully returned to her fingers now, pins and needles giving way to normal sensation, the threat of frostbite receding. Her mind, which the cold had numbed into simple survival mode, began working again with its usual precision and speed. She was stranded, had 83 cents and no realistic prospect of returning to Boston, not that there was anything to return to, except a stepmother who despised her and a father who'd made his choice. She'd staked everything on this journey west, on the promise of security and purpose as a mail-order bride to a man who would value her skills. That possibility was gone, rejected as decisively as her stepmother's hospitality had been. But this man, this stern-faced stranger who'd pulled her from the storm and treated her frostbite with competent care, was offering something potentially better. Not marriage, not the immediate security of a husband's name and social position, but work. Real work that would actually use her skills rather than asking her to pretend she didn't possess them. "What's your name?" she asked, because it seemed important to know the name of the man who held her immediate future in his calloused hands. "Samuel Thornton. Most people call me Sam, the ones who bother calling me anything. Not many neighbors out here, and the ones we have prefer keeping to themselves." "Margaret Chen. Maggie, if you prefer." She straightened in her chair, despite the exhaustion pulling at her. "What exactly would this arrangement entail, Mr. Thornton? I'd prefer clarity over polite evasion." "Sam, we're not formal out here, and if you're going to be working for me, we might as well start as we mean to continue." He gestured around the cabin with one broad hand. "You'd live here, plenty of room. I sleep down here by the fire, keeps it tended through the night, so we don't freeze. There's a loft up there that's yours, private space with a good mattress and warm quilts." He paused, clearly organizing his thoughts with the same methodical care he'd shown in everything else. "You'd manage the books, which means tracking inventory, recording sales, handling correspondence with suppliers, making sure I'm not getting cheated, and making sure I'm not accidentally cheating anyone else through bad math. My wife handled all that before she died. I've been trying to manage it myself, but I'm making a hash of it. Ranch work as well? Teaching you ranch work, yes. 2 reasons for that. First, you need to understand what you're keeping books for. Can't track feed costs properly if you don't know how much the animals actually need or what constitutes waste versus reasonable use. Second, if something happens to me, you need to be able to keep the place running long enough to get help or make other arrangements. The practicality of it was almost startling after years of men either overestimating her fragility or underestimating her capability. No false promises about protection or provision, just the straightforward acknowledgement that ranching was dangerous work and contingency plans mattered more than romantic notions. "In exchange," he continued, his voice steady and businesslike, "room and board through the winter. Warm place to sleep 3 meals a day, Clothing appropriate for the work if what you've got isn't suitable. Come spring, if it's working out and you want to stay, we negotiate wages based on what you're actually contributing. If it's not working out, or if you decide you'd rather move on, I'll take you to town and pay for a room at the boarding house until you can figure out your next step. And if I want to leave before spring, same deal. I'll take you to town soon as the weather allows safe travel. Pay for the room, make sure you've got enough money for basic expenses while you sort out what comes next. No questions asked, no hard feelings. His expression was serious, almost stern, the gray-blue eyes holding hers without wavering. I'm not looking to trap anyone here, Miss Chen. I need help managing this operation, and I'm willing to pay fair for it. But I won't keep anyone against their will or make them feel obligated to stay out of gratitude or guilt. It was possibly the most honest job offer Margaret had ever received. No hidden expectations lurking beneath polite words, no unspoken rules that would only reveal themselves after she'd committed to a course of action. Just a clear exchange of labor for security, stated plainly enough that even the worst faith interpretation couldn't twist it into something ugly or exploitative. One condition before I accept, she said, because she'd learned through hard experience that clarity prevented problems better than politeness ever could. I need to know your rule. Every household has rules, spoken or unspoken. I've found that the unspoken ones cause the most trouble. I'd rather have them stated clearly from the beginning. Sam's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him since he'd pulled her from the storm. Smart, very smart. All right, Miss Chen. My rule is simple, but it's absolute. Say what you mean, or say nothing at all. I've got no patience for lies, no matter how polite or well-intentioned. You want something, you ask directly. You disagree with something, you speak up plainly. You think I'm doing something wrong or stupid or dangerous, you tell me to my face. He leaned forward slightly, intensity radiating from him like heat from the fire. I expect the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. My wife died because I didn't push hard enough when something seemed wrong, didn't insist on getting the doctor when she said she was fine. I won't make that mistake again. Truth might hurt, but lies and evasion kill. Margaret felt something shift in her understanding of this man. That underlying intensity made more sense now, the careful attention to detail, the methodical competence. He was someone who'd learned hard lessons and integrated them thoroughly. What if I point out that you're doing something incorrectly with the ranch? Men generally don't appreciate women correcting them, in my experience. Then I'll listen, same as I'd listen to any hired hand with useful information. Might not always take the advice, might have reasons for doing things a certain way that aren't immediately obvious. But I'll always hear you out, and if you're right, I'll admit it. He paused. Pride's expensive out here, Miss Chen. Can't afford it. If you know a better way to do something, or if you spot a problem I've missed, that's valuable information. I'd be a fool to ignore it just because it comes from a woman instead of a man. Margaret considered this carefully, weighing his words against her experience. She'd worked for men who claimed they wanted honest feedback and then punished anyone who offered it. Edgar Whitmore had been exactly that type, soliciting her opinion on his ledgers and then calling her uppity when she'd provided it. But something about Samuel Thornton's manner suggested he meant what he said. There was a directness to him, a plainness that matched the stark functionality of his cabin. She looked around more carefully now, taking in details. No decoration except what served a purpose. Books on the shelves, but they were practical volumes about animal husbandry and weather prediction, not poetry or fiction. Tools hung on pegs where they'd be easy to reach. Everything positioned for maximum utility with minimum wasted motion. This was a man who valued what worked over what looked good, who preferred honest function over pretty lies. I have a condition of my own for your rule, she said, meeting his eyes directly. This honesty must flow both directions. You must also tell me the truth, especially when it's uncomfortable. If I'm doing something wrong, if my work isn't satisfactory, If you're regretting this arrangement, you tell me directly rather than letting resentment build. This only works if we're both committed to the same standard." Samuel Thornton extended his hand across the space between their chairs, that same firm grip as before. "Fair enough, Miss Chen. We have an agreement." Margaret took his hand. His grip was warm and firm, calloused from years of manual labor, the skin rough in a way that spoke of work done without gloves, even in harsh weather. They shook on it, and Margaret felt something shift in her chest. Not relief exactly, though there was certainly relief in knowing she wouldn't be cast back into the storm, something more complex than simple relief. The sense that she'd just stepped off a cliff into empty air, uncertain if she'd fall or fly, but committed to the descent either way. Whatever came next, she'd chosen it, chosen him, chosen this arrangement, chosen to trust that his honesty was real and not another pretty lie dressed up in plain words. She'd know soon enough which it was. Sam stood and moved to the stove, pulling out ingredients with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd been cooking for himself for far too long. Bacon, beans, cornmeal for bread. His movements were economical, no wasted motion, each action flowing into the next with the smooth rhythm of long habit. "You must be hungry. When's the last time you ate?" "Yesterday morning, before I left Whitmore's ranch. The coach didn't stop for lunch, and I was too anxious to eat the hardtack the driver offered." Sam made a disapproving sound deep in his throat and started cooking with the same quiet competence he'd shown in everything else. Margaret watched him work, noting how he kept everything within easy reach, how he'd arranged his kitchen space for maximum efficiency. This was a man who'd developed systems that worked and saw no reason to change them. The cabin itself was more interesting now that she had time to observe it properly. Single room, perhaps 20 feet by 30, with the loft taking up half the space above. The stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney rising through the roof in a column of mortared river rock that spoke of skilled construction. The cast-iron stove stood in the opposite corner, its pipe venting through the wall with careful attention to fire safety. Between the fireplace and stove, the cabin stayed remarkably warm, despite the storm still raging outside. She could hear the wind battering the walls, but the thick logs held steady, barely creaking under the assault. This was solid construction, built to last decades rather than years. The furniture was simple but well made. The chairs they sat in, crafted from local pine with seats worn smooth by use. A sturdy table that could seat 6 if needed, though Margaret suspected it rarely did. Shelves built into the walls holding supplies and a surprising number of books. And a bed along one wall, neatly made with military precision. Everything spoke of careful maintenance, of a man who took care of what he had because he understood its value and couldn't easily replace it. "You said your wife died 4 years ago," Margaret ventured, watching him flip bacon with a long fork. 4 years this coming March. Cancer. His voice was flat, carefully emptied of emotion in a way that suggested the emotion was still there, just deeply buried. Started in her breast, spread to her lungs and liver. Took her slow over 18 months. Doctor from Greystone came out twice, said there was nothing to be done except keep her comfortable. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Appreciate it." He transferred the bacon to a plate, started the beans heating in the bacon grease. "But I'm not looking for sympathy, Miss Chen. I'm looking for someone who can keep my accounts straight and won't balk at hard work. You strike me as someone who can do both." It wasn't a compliment exactly, but coming from Sam Thornton, it felt like one. Margaret settled deeper into the chair, finally warm all the way through for the first time since the stagecoach had abandoned her. Outside, the wind still howled, the blizzard showing no signs of stopping. But inside this sturdy cabin with its crackling fire and the smell of cooking bacon, she felt something she hadn't felt since her mother died. Safe. Actually, genuinely safe. Sam served the meal on simple tin plates. The bacon was crisp, the beans seasoned with salt pork and what tasted like molasses, the cornbread dense and filling in the way of frontier cooking that prioritized sustenance over refinement. Margaret ate with unladylike speed, too hungry to care about the manners her mother had drilled into her. He didn't comment, just refilled her plate when she finished and poured more coffee without asking if she wanted it. "Tell me about Boston," he said when they'd both finished eating and were lingering over second cups of coffee. "What brought you west? The real reason, not the version you'd tell in polite company." Margaret wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, feeling the warmth seep through the tin, considering how much truth to offer. But Sam's rule was clear, and she'd agreed to it. Honesty, even when uncomfortable. Especially when uncomfortable. "My mother died 2 years ago this February. Pneumonia, complicated by a lifetime of disappointment and suppressed brilliance." The words came out harder than she'd intended, edged with an anger that hadn't diminished with time. "My father remarried within 6 months. Catherine Sullivan, daughter of his business partner. 28 years old, closer to my age than his." Sam said nothing, just watched her with those steady winter eyes, listening with the same focused attention he'd brought to treating her frostbite, to cooking their meal, to everything he did. She found it easier to continue under that quiet attention than she would have with false sympathy or platitudes. Catherine made it clear from the beginning that she had no intention of sharing her new home with her husband's half-Chinese daughter. Said my presence undermined her authority as the new lady of the house. Said the servants didn't respect her because they'd known me since childhood and still saw me as family rather than seeing her as their mistress. She paused, taking a long drink of coffee to wash down the bitterness. "My father was in New York on business when she delivered her ultimatum. She gave me 1 month to find other accommodations. By the time he returned, I'd already moved into the boarding house near the mill. Catherine told him I'd chosen to leave, that I was being difficult about accepting her as his wife, that I'd insulted her in front of the staff. Your father believed her?" There was an edge in Sam's voice now, something sharp that suggested he had strong opinions about fathers who abandoned their daughters. "My father wanted to believe her. It was easier than acknowledging he'd married a woman young enough to be his daughter, primarily because she made him feel young again." Margaret met Sam's eyes directly. "He gave me $300 as what he called a settlement. Told me it was more than generous considering I was now a grown woman who should be making her own way in the world. Said he hoped I'd use it wisely to find a husband since I'd clearly demonstrated I had no talent for being a daughter." Sam's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. "Those were his exact words?" "Word for word. I remember them quite clearly." She smiled without humor. "I used 200 of that generous settlement to pay off my mother's medical debts. She'd accumulated them in her final year, expensive medicines, that did nothing except ease the pain slightly. I couldn't bear to leave them unpaid, to have her memory associated with debt. That left you with $100. 70, after I paid 6 months' rent at the boarding house. I'd been saving from my mill wages, had another 40 put aside. When the mill closed, I had $110 total and no prospects in a city that made it abundantly clear women like me weren't welcome in positions of real responsibility." She set down her coffee cup with careful precision. "I tried finding similar work, applied to every business in Boston that might need an accountant or bookkeeper. Most wouldn't even grant me an interview once they realized I was a woman. The ones that would see me offered half what they'd pay a man for identical work. And several made it clear they expected me to be grateful for the opportunity to prove myself. You weren't grateful. No, I wasn't grateful for the chance to do twice the work for half the pay while pretending I was fortunate to have it." Margaret's voice hardened. Mrs. Porter's advertisement promised something different. A fresh start in a place that valued capability over pedigree. A chance to be useful rather than ornamental. I spent $50 on the journey west and the matchmaking fee. The remaining $60 I budgeted for establishing myself, buying appropriate clothing, making a good impression. What happened to the rest? Edgar Whitmore rejected me after 3 days. I paid the stagecoach driver $40 to take me back to Greystone, nearly double the normal fare, because of the threatening weather. He assured me we'd make it before the storm hit. Instead, he kept my money and abandoned me the moment the snow started falling in earnest. Sam was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stood, moved to a small desk in the corner, and pulled out a piece of paper and pencil, wrote something in careful, labored script, folded it, and tucked it into his shirt pocket. What was that? Reminder to have a conversation with Jake Morrison when the weather clears. Man needs to understand that stealing from stranded women isn't acceptable behavior, even for a bastard like him. I'd rather you didn't make trouble on my account. I can't afford enemies when I have nowhere else to go. Won't be trouble. Sam's voice was flat, final. Just a conversation. And Morrison's not the kind of enemy you need to worry about. He's a coward who preys on people he thinks can't fight back. Once he understands you're under my protection, he'll leave you alone. Under my protection. The words should have rankled, should have triggered her hard-won independence and self-sufficiency. But Margaret found herself oddly comforted by them instead. Not because she needed protection, but because Sam offered it without expecting gratitude or subservience in return. Just a simple statement of fact. You're part of my household now, which means anyone who wrongs you wrongs me. She filed that away for later consideration. The storm howled on through the afternoon and into the evening. Sam showed Margaret the loft, a surprisingly spacious area with a real bed frame and mattress, thick quilts that smelled of cedar and lavender, a small window that, in better weather, would offer a view of the valley. Private space, as he'd promised, a place to retreat when the cabin felt too small or solitude became necessary. Quilts were my wife's work, Sam said, running a hand over the topmost one. Rachel. She was a fine seamstress, could make something beautiful out of scraps that most people would throw away. This one here, she made it the first winter we were married. Every square is from a different source. Her wedding dress, my Sunday shirt, curtains from her mother's house back in Ohio. Margaret touched the quilt gently, feeling the careful stitches, the love and skill worked into every seam. It's beautiful. It's warm. Beauty's a bonus, but warmth is what matters when the temperature drops below zero and stays there for weeks. He turned to descend the ladder. Get some rest if you can. Tomorrow we'll look at the books, see what kind of mess you're dealing with. Storm should break by day after tomorrow, and then the real work begins. But Margaret wasn't tired, despite the ordeal of the day. Her mind was too active, thoughts churning with possibilities and calculations, and the strange sense that her life had just pivoted on an axis she hadn't known existed. She descended the ladder to find Sam pulling out that battered wooden crate from beneath his bed. Might as well start now if you're not sleeping. Can't do outside work in this weather anyway, and you'll want to know what you've gotten yourself into. The crate was worse than she'd feared, and exactly what she'd expected based on his admission of mathematical incompetence. Ledgers with entries crossed out and rewritten. Loose receipts bundled with string but not organized by date or vendor. Correspondence mixed with invoices, mixed with what looked like personal letters. Years of accumulated paperwork with no apparent system beyond throwing it all in one place and hoping for the best. Margaret's fingers actually itched to start organizing. This was chaos of a type she understood, a problem with clear solutions if you just applied proper methodology and attention to detail. I know it's bad, Sam said, sounding defensive for the first time since she'd met him. Rachel kept it all proper, had systems for everything. She'd write down every penny spent, cross-reference everything, could tell you at a glance what we'd made or lost in any given month. After she died, I tried to keep it up, but I'd come in from 18-hour days too exhausted to think straight, and the numbers never made sense the way they should. He gestured at the crate with something like despair. Eventually, I gave up trying to match her organization and just started throwing everything in here. Figured it was better to have it all in one place than scattered across the cabin, even if it was a mess. Margaret pulled out the most recent ledger, opened it to a random page. The handwriting was terrible, numbers crammed together, some entries crossed out multiple times. But as her eyes adjusted to the chaos, she began to see the structure underneath. Sam had been trying. He'd attempted to create columns for income and expenses, had noted dates even if they weren't always in order. He just lacked the skill to do it properly. "This isn't as bad as it looks," she said, choosing her words carefully. "The information is all here. It's just not organized in a way that makes it useful for decision-making or planning." She spent the next hour asking questions while Sam answered with increasing detail. The picture that emerged was of a moderately successful operation run by a competent rancher who was slowly bleeding money through inefficiencies he couldn't see because he lacked the skills to track them properly. He raised 18 head of Hereford cattle, down from 23 the previous year. He'd lost 5 to the brutal winter, something that clearly still bothered him from the way his voice tightened when he mentioned it. Sold twice yearly to buyers from Cheyenne. Kept 12 sheep that his wife had wanted for wool, but that now just ate feed and produced nothing because he didn't know how to shear them properly. Bought feed quarterly from Anderson's Feed and Grain in Greystone. Kept 24 chickens for eggs, 4 horses for working the ranch. The land was 180 acres of deeded property, plus grazing rights on 300 acres of federal land. Water from Thornton Creek, which ran year-round even in drought years. It was a good operation, could be profitable, should be profitable. But everywhere Margaret looked, she saw money disappearing into inefficiencies. "This feed supplier," she said, pulling out a bundle of receipts. "Anderson's. You're paying significantly more than you should be." Sam leaned forward, frowning. "How can you tell?" "Look at the pattern. 60 bags monthly at $3 per bag. $180 per delivery, paid quarterly. That's $540 per year just for feed." She pulled out a blank piece of paper and started calculating, her pencil moving with the speed of long practice. But most suppliers offer bulk discounts at certain thresholds. If you ordered 200 bags quarterly instead of 60 bags monthly, the per-unit cost would drop substantially. She showed him her calculations. Bulk pricing typically offers 10 to 15% discount at higher volumes. At 200 bags, you'd likely pay $2.67 per bag instead of $3. That's a savings of $66 per order, or $198 annually. That's nearly $200. Sam's voice was flat, with something that might have been anger or might have been dismay. "For doing nothing except changing how you structure your purchases, yes, and that's assuming you order alone. If you could convince your neighbors to pool their orders, the savings would be even more significant." Rachel never mentioned that. Rachel probably didn't know to ask. Most people assume their supplier is giving them the best available price, especially if they've worked together for years. There's trust involved. But suppliers are businesses. They want volume. They'll give better terms for larger orders. Margaret set down her pencil, met his eyes directly. "I negotiated with 47 different suppliers at the mill, Mr. Thornton. Everything from raw cotton to replacement parts to coal for the boilers. I learned very quickly that the first price quoted is almost never the best price available. You just have to know how to ask." Something shifted in Sam's expression. That same calculation she'd seen when he'd first heard about her accounting experience. "When the weather clears, we'll ride into Greystone together. You'll talk to Anderson about renegotiating terms. He may not appreciate a woman questioning his pricing structure. Anderson can appreciate whatever he damn well pleases. I appreciate keeping $200 in my pocket instead of giving it to him unnecessarily." Sam's voice was firm. "You work for me now. That means you speak with my authority when it comes to business matters. Anyone who doesn't like it can take their concerns to me directly." But convincing Anderson was only the first step. The real savings, Margaret knew, would come from pooling orders across multiple ranches. "What if we approached our neighbors?" she suggested that evening over supper. "If we could convince 6 or 8 other ranches to combine their feed orders, we could negotiate even better terms." Sam considered this, chewing slowly. Most of them are independent-minded. Don't like the idea of cooperating. Think it makes them look weak or dependent. Then we'll convince them with numbers, not philosophy." 3 weeks later, Sam hosted a meeting in their barn. 8 ranchers from neighboring properties arrived on horseback, their expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile. Margaret recognized the type immediately. Men in their 40s and 50s who'd built their operations through grit and independence, who saw cooperation as weakness. They sat on rough benches Sam had arranged, arms crossed, weathered faces set in identical expressions of doubt. Margaret stood at a makeshift podium constructed from hay bales and a plank of wood, very conscious of being the only woman in the space and the youngest person by at least 15 years. "Gentlemen," she began, keeping her voice level and professional, "Mr. Thornton has asked me to present a proposal that could save each of you approximately $200 annually on feed costs alone." "Woman's got no business teaching men about ranching," one of them muttered, loud enough to be clearly heard. Tom Bradley, she thought, from the Double B Ranch 3 miles east. Margaret didn't flinch. "You're absolutely correct, Mr. Bradley. I have no business teaching you about ranching. You've all been doing it longer than I've been alive, and doing it successfully. But I do have business teaching you about purchasing negotiations and bulk pricing strategies, because that's what I did professionally for 5 years at Boston Textile Mill." She pulled out the calculations she'd prepared, numbers written in her clear, precise hand. "Anderson's Feed and Grain currently charges each of you $3 per bag, based on Mr. Thornton's records and my estimates of average herd sizes. You each purchase approximately 600 bags annually. That's $1,800 per ranch." She wrote the numbers large enough for everyone to see. 8 ranches times $1,800 equals $14,400 in total annual feed purchases. The hostile expressions shifted slightly. Numbers had a way of commanding attention. "Now, if we pool our orders and purchase as a cooperative, one entity buying 4,800 bags quarterly instead of 8 separate entities buying 600 bags monthly, we gain significant negotiating leverage. Based on standard industry bulk pricing structures, we should achieve a minimum 15% discount." Margaret wrote the new calculation, $2.55 per bag instead of $3. That's a savings of 45 cents per bag, or $270 per ranch per year, over $2,000 saved collectively. She set down her chalk and faced them directly. "That money stays in your pockets instead of padding Anderson's profits. You use it to expand your herds, improve your equipment, provide for your families. All you have to do is coordinate your purchasing." A long silence. Then a rancher in the back, older than the others, spoke up. "Who manages this cooperative? Who keeps the books, makes sure everyone pays their fair share, doesn't cheat?" "I will," Margaret said. "Free of charge for the first year to prove the concept works. After that, we charge each ranch a modest administrative fee, say $5 annually, which still leaves you saving over $260 each. And if it doesn't work, if Anderson refuses to deal with a cooperative, then we take our business to Cheyenne suppliers, who will appreciate $14,000 in annual orders. Anderson needs our business more than we need his store." The men looked at each other, and Margaret could see the war happening behind their eyes. Pride versus profit, independence versus collaboration. The old way versus a new way that came from a woman young enough to be their daughter. Finally, Tom Bradley stood, the man who'd first objected, who'd called her presumptuous for teaching men about business. He was perhaps 55, his face deeply lined, his hands scarred from decades of hard work. "I'll try it for 6 months, he said slowly. "If the savings are what you say, if the system works like you claim, I'll commit for a full year." One by one the others agreed, some reluctantly, some with visible skepticism, but all of them swayed by numbers that couldn't be argued with. The Thornton County Ranchers Cooperative was born that February night in a barn lit by lanterns, founded by a woman from Boston who understood that numbers didn't care about gender or convention, only accuracy. As the ranchers filed out into the cold night, Tom Bradley paused at the door. "Mrs. "Thornton," he said. She'd married Sam 2 weeks earlier in Judge Morrison's office. "I was wrong to speak against you. A man or woman who can save me $200 a year has earned the right to speak." "I appreciate that, Mr. Bradley, though I would have earned that right whether I saved you money or not, simply by knowing what I'm talking about." His weathered face cracked into something almost like a smile. "Yes, ma'am, I expect you would have." Margaret felt something warm unfold in her chest. Not attraction exactly, though Sam Thornton was undeniably attractive in his severe, competent way. Something deeper than physical response, recognition maybe, of finding someone who meant what he said about valuing capability over convention. She returned her attention to the ledgers, flipping through pages of difficult handwriting. "What else are you buying regularly?" "Not much. Basics from the general store. Flour, sugar, coffee, salt, fabric when I need it, though I'm terrible at sewing, so I mostly just patch what I have until it falls apart. Pay the blacksmith for horseshoeing and repairs I can't handle myself. Medical supplies? Only in emergencies. Can't afford a doctor for minor issues, and Greystone doesn't have one anyway. Nearest doctor is 3 days' ride in Cheyenne, which means you don't go unless you're dying." Margaret made note of that. Medical care in remote areas was always precarious, something she'd need to educate herself about if she was going to be useful here. "What about the sheep? You mentioned your wife wanted them for wool. What are you doing with the wool now?" Sam's expression darkened, his jaw tightening in a way that suggested this was a sore subject. "Shearing them once a year, barely managing that, and then throwing the wool out because I don't know what to do with it and don't have time to learn." "You're throwing it out." Margaret set down her pencil very carefully, using the deliberate motion to control her reaction. "Mr. Thornton, do you have any idea what good quality wool sells for?" "Never thought to find out." She did quick mental calculations, pulling from memory of the mill's purchasing records. A healthy sheep produces 8 to 12 pounds of wool per shearing depending on breed and care. If these are merino crosses, which your notes suggest they might be, you're looking at closer to 10 pounds per animal. Clean, properly carded wool sells to textile mills for approximately $2 per pound wholesale. She wrote the numbers as she spoke, making it visual. 12 sheep times 10 pounds each times $2 per pound. That's $240 per year, Mr. Thornton. You're literally discarding $240 annually because you don't know how to process wool properly. Sam sat very still, his face gone carefully blank in the way of a man absorbing information he didn't want to believe. "I don't know how to shear sheep without hurting them, don't know how to clean wool or card it or any of the processing that needs to happen before it's sellable. Rachel was going to learn from a book she'd ordered from Chicago, but she got sick before it arrived." "Do you still have the book?" "Somewhere. Never looked at it after she died. Too painful." "Then we find it, and we learn together." Margaret's voice was firm. "I've never worked with raw wool, but I understand industrial fiber processing from my time at the mill. The principles should be similar. We can figure it out." "Before spring shearing?" "Shearing happens in early spring, correct? Late March or early April, depending on weather." At his nod, she continued, "That gives us 6 to 8 weeks. Sufficient time to study the process, practice on 1 or 2 sheep, develop competence before attempting the full flock." She could see him weighing this, balancing potential profit against time and effort and the risk of failure. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right, we'll learn to process wool properly. Can't afford to throw away that kind of money, not when the ranch is barely breaking even as it is." He paused. "What else are you seeing?" Margaret returned to the ledgers with renewed focus. The deeper she dug, the more inefficiencies emerged. Not fraud or gross negligence, just the accumulated costs of a man doing his best with skills he didn't possess. He was overpaying the blacksmith by about 20% because he didn't know the standard rate, and the smith hadn't volunteered to correct him. He'd missed claiming a tax exemption on agricultural equipment for 3 consecutive years, costing roughly $40 in unnecessary taxes. His beef sale prices varied wildly year to year, suggesting he accepted whatever buyers offered rather than negotiating based on current market conditions. None of these were individually catastrophic, but collectively they represented hundreds of dollars in lost income and unnecessary expenses. For a ranch this size operating on margins this narrow, that kind of steady bleeding could mean the difference between building security and slowly drowning in debt. "I'll need several days to sort through all of this properly," Margaret said after 2 hours of intensive review. "Create an accurate inventory, reconcile accounts, establish baseline costs for everything. Once I have that foundation, I can identify specific inefficiencies and develop plans to address them. Take whatever time you need. I'd rather have it done right than done quick and wrong." Margaret nodded and reached for another bundle of papers. As she did, her eye caught on a letter buried in the pile. The letterhead made her pause, recognition hitting like a physical blow. Boston Textile Mill. Her old employer. "Mr. Thornton, did your wife correspond with textile mills about wool sales?" "She might have. Like I said, she was planning to get into wool processing before she got sick. Probably contacted several companies about pricing and requirements." Margaret unfolded the letter with careful hands, a strange sense of destiny unfolding as she read. It was dated 3 years ago, addressed to Rachel Thornton, in care of General Delivery Greystone, signed by Thomas Whitmore, Director of Purchasing, her direct supervisor during her time at the mill. The letter was professionally cordial, expressing interest in establishing a supply relationship. "Mrs. Thornton, we are pleased to confirm interest in purchasing cleaned carded wool at the rates discussed in your inquiry. We currently source from suppliers in Ohio and Pennsylvania at an average cost of $2.15 per pound delivered. If you can match this pricing while maintaining our quality standards, we would be willing to establish a contract for annual purchase of up to 500 pounds with option to expand based on satisfactory performance." 500 pounds. At $2 per pound, that was $1,000 annually. Enough to transform the ranch's financial situation entirely, enough to justify expanding the flock significantly and making wool a primary income source rather than a waste product. "Your wife was setting up a direct supply contract with Boston Textile Mill," Margaret said slowly, her mind already racing through possibilities. "If she'd lived to complete the arrangement, you could have been selling wool directly to them at premium prices instead of letting it rot." Sam's jaw clenched, a muscle jumping beneath the weathered skin. "She never told me. Must have been planning it as a surprise once everything was finalized. The letter is 3 years old. They've likely moved on to other arrangements by now, but Mr. Whitmore is still there and he knows me." Margaret looked up from the letter, meeting Sam's eyes. "Knows I'm reliable and competent. If I wrote explaining the situation, we might be able to revive the conversation. At minimum, I could get current pricing information and requirements." "You'd do that? Use your connections for a ranch you've been part of for less than a day? It's good business, not a favor. Boston Textile prefers direct supplier relationships because it reduces costs on both ends. They'd be interested in a reliable Western source, especially if we can offer competitive pricing with lower shipping costs than their Ohio suppliers." She tucked the letter carefully with her notes. "I'll draft correspondence once I've assessed the flock and confirmed we can reasonably meet their quality and volume requirements. No point promising what we can't deliver." They worked in companionable silence for another hour, Margaret sorting papers into organized stacks, while Sam occasionally answered questions or clarified cryptic ledger entries. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside the cabin warmth held steady, and the work was deeply satisfying in a way Margaret hadn't experienced since the mill closed. This was what she was good at: finding inefficiencies, creating systems, turning chaos into comprehensible order. The fact that she was doing it for a ranch instead of a factory changed nothing fundamental about the satisfaction of the work itself. As evening deepened into night, Sam made a simple supper of fried potatoes and the remaining bacon. They ate mostly in silence, both tired from the intensity of reviewing years of accumulated financial chaos. But it was comfortable silence, the kind that came from shared purpose rather than awkward unfamiliarity. "One more thing before you sleep," Sam said as they cleaned the dishes. "You mentioned I can barely read. How much schooling did you observe I had?" "You write laboriously, but correctly. You can clearly read basic texts. I'd estimate 6 to 8 years of formal education, possibly less, if you were an attentive student." 6 years before my father pulled me to work our family farm in Missouri, I can read simple things well enough, can write my name and basic correspondence. But anything more complicated than a receipt or short note, I struggle. He dried the last plate with slow, methodical care. "Would you be willing to teach me? Really teach me? Not just enough to muddle through, but enough to handle business correspondence and understand contracts and maybe even read for pleasure someday?" Margaret studied him in the firelight, this proud man who'd just admitted a vulnerability that many would hide behind bluster or excuse. "You're willing to learn at 34? Some would say you're too old for new skills. Some would say a woman can't manage accounts for a major textile mill. Both statements are equally stupid." His mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "I'm not too old to learn, I'm just uneducated. There's a considerable difference." There is indeed. Margaret felt warmth bloom in her chest again, that same recognition of finding someone who valued capability over convention. "In exchange for teaching you reading and mathematics, you'll teach me everything about running this ranch. Not just the bookkeeping, but the actual work. Animal husbandry, equipment maintenance, weather prediction, all of it." "Why would you want to learn that? You're a bookkeeper, not a rancher." "Because I'm alone in the world with no family to fall back on. If something happens to you, or if we part ways and I need to find other work, knowing only bookkeeping limits my options. Knowing how to manage an entire operation makes me considerably more valuable." She met his eyes steadily. "Self-sufficiency matters, Mr. Thornton. I learned that lesson when my father remarried, and my security evaporated overnight." Sam extended his hand across the space between them. "Partners in education, then. I teach you ranching, you teach me reading and ciphering. Fair exchange." Margaret took his hand, feeling the calluses, the strength, the warmth. Partners in education. They shook on it, and Margaret felt that shift in her chest again, stronger now. Not hope exactly, because hope implied uncertainty. This was something more solid. Purpose, maybe. Or the foundation of something that might grow into purpose if they worked at it consistently. That night, Margaret lay in the loft under Rachel Thornton's carefully stitched quilt, listening to the storm rage against walls that held steady despite the assault. Below, she could hear Sam banking the fire, preparing for sleep with the same methodical care he brought to everything. She should have been anxious about her future, worried about whether this arrangement would work, concerned about living in close quarters with a man she barely knew. Instead, she felt calm, settled in a way she hadn't since her mother's death, maybe longer. Tomorrow, they'd continue sorting the financial chaos. She'd begin teaching Sam to read properly, and he'd begin teaching her the realities of ranch work. They'd start building something together, not a romance, but something potentially more durable. A partnership based on mutual need and honest respect, rather than sentiment that would fade when tested by hardship. Margaret pulled the quilt tighter and let sleep take her, the last conscious thought drifting through her mind both simple and profound. "I chose this. Whatever comes, I chose it freely with open eyes. That matters more than I realized." And in the darkness of the cabin, while the storm howled and the fire crackled, and Samuel Thornton settled into his own rest below, Margaret Chen smiled. The storm broke on the third day, just as Sam had predicted. Margaret woke to silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. No wind howling, no snow battering the walls. Just crystalline quiet and pale sunlight filtering through the loft window, painting everything in shades of white and gold. She descended the ladder to find Sam already dressed in heavy work clothes, pulling on boots that had been oiled to waterproof them. He glanced up at her arrival. "Storm's done. Snow's probably 4 feet deep in the drifts, less where the wind swept it clear. I need to dig out to the barn, make sure the stock survived. You'll stay inside where it's warm. I'll help." "You don't know how." "Then you'll teach me. That was our agreement, wasn't it? You teach me ranching, I teach you reading." Margaret moved to where her newly acquired winter gear hung by the door. Martha Chen had outfitted her well at the mercantile before she'd left for Whitmore's ranch. Heavy wool coat, boots lined with rabbit fur, gloves thick enough to handle tools in freezing weather. Sam watched her dress with an expression caught between approval and concern. "It's brutal work. Temperatures probably 10 below, and that's being optimistic. Wind chill makes it feel colder." "Then we'd better get started before it gets worse." Something flickered in his eyes. Respect, maybe, or the beginning of it. He handed her a shovel from the rack by the door and took one himself. "Stay close. Snow this deep can be disorienting. People have gotten lost 10 feet from their own doors in conditions like this." The world outside was transformed. Wyoming had always been stark, but the blizzard had rendered it into something almost alien. Snow stretched in every direction, interrupted only by the dark shapes of buildings and fence posts. The barn was perhaps 50 yards from the cabin, but looked miles away across an unbroken expanse of white. Sam began shoveling with steady, economical movements, not rushing, not trying to move too much snow at once, just consistent forward progress. Margaret copied his technique, quickly understanding why he'd warned her about the difficulty. The snow was heavy, wet, in a way that made each shovelful a significant weight. Within 10 minutes her arms burned with effort. They worked in silence for an hour, then 2. Sam periodically checked that she was managing, offering water from a canteen he'd brought, but didn't coddle or suggest she rest. Just kept working with the steady patience of a man who'd done this many times before and knew that panic or haste only made it harder. When they finally broke through to the barn, Margaret's entire body ached. Her breath came in ragged gasps that frosted immediately in the frigid air. But they'd done it, created a path wide enough for Sam to open the barn door and check on the animals. The horses were fine, huddled together for warmth but otherwise healthy. Sam moved among them with gentle efficiency, checking hooves, running hands over their bodies to assess condition, murmuring reassurances in a voice softer than Margaret had yet heard from him. "They're good creatures," he said, more to himself than to her. "Knew to stay calm, conserve energy. Some animals panic in storms, hurt themselves trying to break free. These ones understand patience." Margaret watched him work, filing away observations. The way he checked each horse individually, despite the cold and his own exhaustion. The attention he paid to small details, a slight swelling on one hoof that needed monitoring, a place where another horse's blanket had rubbed and created a sore spot. This wasn't just competence. This was care, deep and genuine. They spent another hour tending the stock, breaking ice in water troughs, distributing feed, making sure each animal had what it needed. By the time they returned to the cabin, the sun was high overhead, and Margaret was more exhausted than she'd been after 12-hour shifts at the mill. Sam made lunch, simple sandwiches and hot coffee that tasted better than anything Margaret could remember. They ate in companionable silence, both too tired for conversation. But it was good exhaustion, the kind that came from necessary work completed successfully. "You did well," Sam said finally, cradling his coffee. "Most people from the city would have given up after the first half hour. Most people from the city haven't worked factory shifts where stopping meant losing wages you needed to survive." "Fair point." He studied her for a moment. "We'll need to check on the cattle tomorrow. They're in the south pasture, should have shelter from the worst of it, but I need to verify. That'll be a longer journey, probably most of the day. I'll be ready." The pattern established itself over the following weeks. Mornings were for ranch work, and the work was endless. Checking stock, repairing fences damaged by the storm, chopping wood for the constantly hungry stove and fireplace. Afternoons were for the books. Books. Margaret systematically organizing years of chaos into comprehensible order. Evenings were for education. Margaret teaching Sam to read with increasing fluency while he taught her to identify animal illnesses, predict weather changes, understand the rhythms of the land. February gave way to March, and with it came the first hints of spring. The snow began melting in earnest, turning the ranch into a maze of mud and slush. And with the thaw came Edgar Whitmore. Margaret was in the barn tending the horses when she heard voices from the yard, Sam's, low and controlled. Another man's, slurred with drink and anger. "She's mine, Thornton. I paid Mrs. Porter for a bride, and that's what I'm owed." Margaret set down the curry comb and moved to the barn door. Whitmore stood in the yard, swaying slightly, his face red from cold or alcohol or both. Sam stood between him and the cabin, arms crossed, expression carved from stone. "Miss Chen works for me now. She's not yours, never was yours, and your opinion on the matter doesn't factor into any decision she makes. You can't just steal another man's bride." "I didn't steal anything. You rejected her, remember? Called her too opinionated for your taste. She's since demonstrated that those opinions have saved me over $300 in the last month alone. I'd say your judgment was poor." Whitmore's face went from red to purple. "I changed my mind. A man has a right to change his mind." "A man has a right to many things. Doesn't mean he gets them." Sam's voice was flat, final. "Miss Chen, would you join us, please?" Margaret stepped from the barn, very conscious of how she must look. Work clothes splattered with mud, and worse, hair coming loose from its pins, hands roughened by labor. Nothing like the polished young woman who'd arrived at Whitmore's ranch 2 months ago. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm surprised to see you." "Miss Chen, I've come to apologize. I was hasty in my judgment. I'd like you to reconsider our arrangement." His words were careful, too practiced, as if he'd rehearsed them. "I can offer you a proper home, the respectability of marriage, security." "I have all those things here, Mr. Whitmore. Mr. Thornton has been generous with his wages." It was a slight exaggeration. They hadn't formalized wages yet, but the implication was clear. "I'm quite satisfied with my current position. Working as a hired hand isn't suitable for a woman of your education." "No, you're right. Which is why I'm working as Mr. Thornton's business manager and accountant. Positions that actually utilize my education rather than asking me to pretend I don't possess it." Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "You're living here, unmarried, with a man. Do you understand what that does to your reputation?" "I understand that my reputation survived being abandoned in a blizzard by a stagecoach driver you recommended, Mr. Whitmore. I expect it will survive my current employment as well." "The town is talking. Mrs. Porter is concerned about the propriety." "Then perhaps you and Mrs. Porter should discuss your concerns with each other rather than troubling me with them." Margaret's voice cooled to ice. "I made my choice freely and with full understanding of the situation. I'm not leaving." Whitmore turned to Sam, voice rising. "You've poisoned her against me, filled her head with lies about my character." "I've barely mentioned you at all, Whitmore. You're not that interesting." Sam's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Miss Chen made her decision based on her own assessment of her options. You rejected her when she tried to help you. I hired her for exactly that ability. The difference isn't in anything I said, it's in how we value her competence." The truth of that statement hung in the cold air. Whitmore had no response that wouldn't make him look worse, so he fell back on bluster. "This isn't over, Thornton. You can't keep her here against her will." "I'm not keeping her anywhere. She's free to leave any time she chooses, just as she's free to stay." Sam's voice dropped to something dangerous. "But if you come onto my property again, without invitation, If you continue to harass my employee, we'll have a different conversation, one you won't enjoy. Are we clear?" Whitmore's hand moved toward his belt, where a pistol was holstered. Sam didn't move, didn't tense, just watched with the calm patience of a man who'd faced down threats before and wasn't particularly impressed by this one. The moment stretched, then Whitmore's hand dropped, and he spat into the mud. "You'll regret this, both of you." He mounted his horse with difficulty, nearly falling twice, and rode off toward the road. They watched until he disappeared over the rise. "He'll make trouble," Margaret said quietly. "He'll try." Edgar Whitmore's main talent is making threats he can't back up. Sam turned to her, his expression serious. "But he's right about one thing. The town is probably talking. Living arrangements like ours aren't common, and people have opinions about what's proper. Do you care about those opinions?" "Not particularly. But you might. Reputation matters differently for women than men. If this situation becomes socially impossible for you, we should address it before it costs you opportunities." Margaret considered this carefully. She'd spent her entire life navigating the narrow boundaries of what was considered appropriate for women, watching those boundaries constrain her mother until there was nothing left but a ghost in human shape. She'd come west specifically to escape that suffocation. "I have a question, Mr. Thornton, an uncomfortable one that requires an honest answer." "Ask it." "Are you satisfied with our current arrangement? Has my work been valuable enough to justify the room and board you're providing?" Sam's expression didn't change. "Your work has been exceptional. You've identified inefficiencies I didn't know existed, saved me money I was bleeding without realizing it, and you're learning ranch work faster than I expected. I'd be a fool to end this arrangement." "Then I don't care what the town thinks. Let them talk. I'm not leaving a situation that works well for both of us just because it makes other people uncomfortable." She met his eyes directly. "Unless you're concerned about your own reputation?" "My reputation has survived being called the town hermit, and worse. It'll survive employing a competent accountant regardless of her gender." He paused. "But there is another option we should discuss, for practical reasons, not social ones." Margaret's heart kicked against her ribs. "What option?" "Marriage, legal and formal. Would solve the reputation issue, give you protection under my name, ensure you inherit the ranch if something happens to me, instead of it reverting to distant cousins who've never set foot in Wyoming." His voice was carefully neutral, businesslike. "It would be a practical arrangement, not a romantic one. You'd keep your own space in the loft, maintain your independence, continue the work you're already doing. Nothing would change except the legal status. You'd marry me for practical reasons. I'd marry you because you're the most competent person I've met in a decade, and I'd be an idiot to risk losing you to social pressure or legal complications." Sam's eyes held hers. "But I'm not asking you to love me, and I'm not promising to love you. I'm offering a partnership, legal recognition of what we're already building." It should have hurt, that clinical assessment. Should have wounded some part of her that still believed in romance despite everything. But Margaret found herself oddly relieved by the honesty instead. No pretty lies about feelings that might not exist, just clear acknowledgement of mutual benefit and respect. "Can I think about it?" "Take whatever time you need. The offer stands regardless." Sam turned back toward the barn. "Now come help me check that mare's hoof. The swelling's gone down, but I want to make sure it's healing properly." And just like that, they returned to work, as if he hadn't just proposed marriage in the same tone he might use to discuss fence repairs, as if Margaret's entire future hadn't just pivoted on an axis she was still trying to fully comprehend. That evening, Margaret sat in the loft with her mother's hidden journal, the one filled with mathematical proofs and astronomical observations that Mary Ann Chen had created in secret. She ran her fingers over the careful notations, thinking about her mother's life. The brilliant woman who'd married for love and then spent decades being slowly smothered by the limitations that marriage imposed. Sam's proposal was nothing like that. He wasn't asking her to be less than she was. He was asking her to formalize a partnership where she could be fully herself, use all her capabilities without apology or pretense. But it was still marriage. Still a legal binding that would be difficult to escape if the situation became untenable. Still a risk. Margaret thought about the past month, the satisfaction of organizing chaos into comprehensible systems, the unexpected pleasure of learning ranch work, of understanding the rhythms of animals and weather and land, the comfortable silences with Sam, the easy collaboration, the mutual respect that had developed through shared purpose. She thought about the alternative, leaving eventually, finding another position somewhere that might not value her competence, might expect her to pretend to be less capable than she was. Starting over again with nothing except the skills she'd developed and the references Sam would hopefully provide. The choice wasn't difficult when she laid it out that clearly. 2 days later, while they were working together to repair a section of fence damaged by fallen timber, Margaret spoke without preamble. "I accept your proposal, for the practical reasons you outlined, and because I believe we work well together." Sam finished hammering the post he'd been securing before responding. "You're certain? Once we're legally married, extricating yourself becomes considerably more complicated." "I'm certain, though I have conditions." "Name them." "We maintain separate sleeping arrangements unless and until both of us want otherwise. My work and wages remain my own to control. If children result from this arrangement, they receive education regardless of gender, and daughters receive the same opportunities as sons." Sam set down his hammer, considering. "Those terms are acceptable. I have one condition of my own." "Which is?" "Honesty remains absolute between us. If this arrangement stops working, if you're unhappy or want to leave, you tell me directly rather than letting resentment build until it poisons everything." "I won't trap you here, Margaret. But I need to know if you're staying by choice or obligation." "Agreed." She extended her hand. "Partners in marriage, then, as practical an arrangement as partners in education." Sam took her hand, but instead of shaking it, he held it gently between both of his. "I can't promise you romance or grand gestures, but I can promise honesty, respect, and that I'll value your competence as long as I live. That'll have to be enough." "It's more than enough. It's more than I expected to find when I left Boston." They stood there for a moment in the spring sunlight, hands clasped, sealing a bargain that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival and mutual respect. Then Sam released her hand and picked up his hammer. "We should ride to Greystone tomorrow. Talk to Judge Morrison about making this legal. He does circuit rounds, should be in town this week." "Tomorrow, then." The marriage ceremony, such as it was, took place in Judge Morrison's office above the general store 3 days later. The judge was a weathered man in his 60s who'd seen enough frontier marriages to take this one in stride. "Mr. Thornton, Miss Chen, you understand this is a legal and binding contract?" "We do," Sam said. "And you're both entering into it freely, without coercion?" "We are." Morrison studied them for a long moment, then shrugged. "I've married people for worse reasons. At least you're both sober and seem to have thought it through." He pulled out the necessary paperwork. "Sign here and here. I'll file it with the Territorial Registry, and you'll be legally married." Margaret signed her name in clear, precise script. Margaret Chen Thornton. The name looked strange on paper, but felt right in a way she hadn't anticipated. Sam signed next to her, his handwriting noticeably improved from the lessons she'd been giving him. The judge witnessed both signatures, applied his official seal, and just like that, it was done. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Thornton. May you find whatever it is you're looking for." They rode back to the ranch in comfortable silence, newly married, but fundamentally unchanged. That evening, they worked on the books together as usual, Margaret teaching Sam to calculate compound interest while he explained the signs that predicted late frost. It should have felt anticlimactic after the significance of legal marriage. Instead, it felt exactly right. This was what they were building together. Not romance, but something potentially more durable. A partnership based on honest assessment of mutual needs and capabilities. Spring advanced with increasing warmth. The sheep needed shearing, and true to their agreement, Margaret and Sam learned together from Rachel's book. It was awkward, frustrating work that left them both covered in lanolin and bits of wool, laughing despite themselves at their incompetence. But they improved. By the time they'd worked through all 12 sheep, they'd developed reasonable proficiency. The wool they'd harvested and cleaned represented real money, real value that had previously been wasted. Margaret drafted a careful letter to Thomas Whitmore at Boston Textile, explaining her current situation and inquiring about reviving the supply relationship Rachel Thornton had begun establishing. She received a response within 6 weeks. Mrs. Thornton, I was surprised and pleased to learn of your new circumstances. I remember your exceptional work during your time with us and have no doubt you'll bring the same competence to wool processing. We remain interested in establishing a Western supply source at the terms previously discussed with the late Mrs. Thornton. Please send a sample of your current production for quality assessment. Sam read the letter over her shoulder, his breath warm on her neck. He trusted you enough to give us a chance. He trusted my competence enough. There's a difference. Margaret was already drafting a response in her mind. We'll send him our best samples from this season's shearing. If the quality meets their standards, we'll have a guaranteed buyer at premium prices. And if it doesn't, then we learn what needs improving and do better next season. That's how you build a business, Sam. Trial, assessment, adjustment, improvement. The samples went out in July. The response came in August. Their wool met standards. Boston Textile was prepared to offer a contract for annual purchase of up to 500 pounds at $2 per pound, with option to expand if they could increase production while maintaining quality. Margaret did the math immediately. 500 pounds at $2 per pound was $1,000 annually. With their current flock of 12 sheep, they could produce perhaps 120 pounds per year. They'd need to expand the flock significantly to meet potential demand. We should buy more sheep, she told Sam over dinner that evening, 20 more at least. Build the flock to 30 or 40 within 2 years. That's expensive. Breeding stock isn't cheap, and we'd need to expand our grazing area, build better shelter. I've been tracking expenses. We've saved nearly $400 in the past 6 months through the efficiencies we've implemented. Feed costs down, tax burdens reduced, better prices on beef sales. We can afford the investment if we're strategic about it. Sam studied the numbers she'd written out, his reading fluency now good enough to follow complex calculations. You're certain this will work? No business venture is certain, but the risk is calculated and manageable. Boston Textile wants Western wool suppliers. We can provide quality product at competitive prices with lower shipping costs than their current sources. The market opportunity is real. Then we expand the flock. He signed his name to the bottom of her proposal, making it official. Partners in business as well as marriage. Partners in everything worth doing. Then we expand the flock. He signed his name to the bottom of her proposal, making it official. Partners in business as well as marriage. Partners in everything worth doing. Summer faded into autumn, and the ranch prospered in small, measurable ways. The expanded sheep flock was purchased and integrated successfully. The cattle herd remained healthy through careful management. The cooperative now served 23 ranches, saving members over $2,000 annually. But prosperity, Margaret would soon learn, bred enemies. The trouble started in late September. Margaret was at the Mercantile in Greystone when Martha Chen pulled her aside, her usually cheerful face drawn with worry. Margaret, you need to be careful. Mr. Anderson has been drinking heavily at the saloon, telling anyone who'll listen that your cooperative destroyed his business. Martha glanced toward the door. He's hired 3 men, says they're warehouse workers, but nobody's seen them lift anything except whiskey bottles and threats. Anderson is angry about losing business. That's understandable. even if it's his own fault for refusing to negotiate. Margaret selected flour and sugar with practiced efficiency, but he'll accept it eventually. Economics doesn't care about pride. Tom Bradley's barn burned down last week. Everyone knows it was arson, but nobody can prove it. Martha's voice dropped to barely a whisper. And those 3 men? They were seen near Bradley's property the night before the fire. Margaret's hand stilled on the sack of flour. Tom Bradley had been the first rancher to join the cooperative, the one who'd convinced the others to give it a chance. She finished her purchases quickly and rode back to the ranch faster than was safe, arriving just as sunset painted the Wyoming sky in shades of orange that would have been beautiful if she hadn't been consumed by worry. Sam was in the south pasture checking the expanded sheep flock. She found him kneeling beside a ewe, examining her leg with gentle competence. "Sam, we have a problem." He looked up immediately, reading the urgency in her voice. "What kind?" She told him everything. Anderson's hired men, Bradley's barn, the rumors of deliberate violence. Sam's jaw tightened with each detail, but his hands continued their methodical work on the sheep. Anderson's a fool if he thinks violence will bring back his lost profits, but fools with money and wounded pride are dangerous. He stood, wiping his hands on his work pants. "We'll need to be careful, keep the rifles loaded, vary our routines. You're never out here alone after dark." "I won't be driven off by threats, Sam." "I'm not asking you to be. I'm asking you to be smart." His hand found her shoulder, squeezed once. "We built this together. We'll defend it together." The attack came 4 days later, just before dawn. Sam had ridden out early to check the cattle in the north pasture, a routine he'd performed hundreds of times. Margaret was in the cabin updating the cooperative's ledgers when she heard hoofbeats approaching at a gallop far too fast for safety. Through the window she saw Sam's horse Ghost running hard toward the barn, eyes rolling white with panic. Sam was slumped forward in the saddle, one hand pressed to his left side, the other gripping the pommel with white-knuckled desperation. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark and wet against his shirt. Margaret ran. By the time she reached him, Sam had managed to dismount, but was leaning heavily against Ghost's shoulder, his face pale as old bone, breathing shallow and labored. "3 men," he managed through gritted teeth, "jumped me near the creek, had knives, told me to dissolve the cooperative, or next time they'd finish the job." Margaret's hands were already working, supporting his weight, guiding him toward the cabin. Her mind cataloged injuries with the clinical detachment she'd learned in Boston factories where industrial accidents were grimly common. Deep wound to the left side, probably cracked ribs underneath. Significant blood loss, but not arterial spray. Survivable if treated properly, and infection didn't set in. She got him inside onto the bed and began cutting away his shirt with scissors kept sharp for sheep shearing. The wound was 4 inches long, deep enough to have penetrated muscle, jagged from a serrated blade designed to cause maximum damage. "This is going to hurt," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear clawing at her throat. "I need to clean it thoroughly before I can stitch it closed." "Do what you need to do." Margaret boiled water, gathered clean cloth, retrieved the needle and thread Rachel had kept for mending. Her hands didn't shake as she cleaned the wound with whiskey that made Sam hiss through clenched teeth. Didn't shake as she threaded the needle with the same practiced efficiency she brought to everything. 15 stitches at least, she said, more to herself than him. Maybe 20. The wound goes deep. She'd never sutured human flesh before, but the principle was the same as mending torn fabric, she told herself. Steady hands, even tension, consistent spacing between stitches. She could do this, had to do this, because the nearest doctor was 3 days' ride, and Sam would bleed out long before then. The first stitch made Sam grunt low in his throat. By the 5th, sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. By the 10th, he'd gone silent, jaw locked, breathing through his nose in controlled bursts that suggested he was using every ounce of will to stay conscious. "Almost done," Margaret murmured, working with careful precision. "Just 8 more." When she tied off the final stitch, 18 in total, her hands were trembling with released adrenaline. But the wound was closed, The bleeding stopped. The immediate danger of death passed. "You did good," Sam said, his voice rough with pain and something that might have been pride. "Rachel would have been terrified. You stayed calm." "I was terrified. I just didn't let it stop me from working." Margaret bandaged the wound with clean cloth, her movements gentle despite her shaking hands. "You need to rest. No ranch work for at least 2 weeks, possibly 3. Can't. Stock needs tending. Cooperative needs managing. And Anderson's men are still out there. Then I'll tend the stock. I'll manage the cooperative. And if Anderson's men come back, I'll handle them too." Margaret met his eyes, her voice hard as Wyoming granite. "You taught me everything I need to know about running this ranch, Sam. Time to find out if I learned it." For 3 weeks, Margaret ran Thornton Ranch alone. She was up before dawn, tending horses and cattle and sheep, with the methodical efficiency Sam had drilled into her over months of patient teaching. She updated the cooperative ledgers by lamplight after full days of physical labor that left her exhausted to the bone. She rode to each member ranch, warned them about Anderson's men, organized a rotation of armed patrols to protect their properties. The cooperative members, who'd been skeptical of a woman managing their purchasing just months ago, watched her handle a crisis with competence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. She wasn't asking for their help or permission. She was leading, and they found themselves following because she was the only one with a clear plan. On the 4th week, Margaret rode into Greystone with 8 armed ranchers behind her, their rifles prominently displayed across their saddles. They found Anderson in his warehouse, surrounded by his 3 hired thugs, who suddenly looked far less confident when faced with actual opposition. "Mr. Anderson," Margaret said, her voice carrying across the space with perfect clarity, "you made a serious mistake when you sent men to attack my husband. You thought violence would break the cooperative. Instead, it unified us in ways negotiation never could." Anderson's face went red, then purple. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mrs. Thornton. Don't insult my intelligence. Your men attacked Sam Thornton on September 28th at dawn near Thornton Creek. They used serrated knives. They threatened to kill him if he didn't dissolve the cooperative." She gestured to the ranchers behind her, their expressions hard and unforgiving. "These men represent 23 ranches across 3 counties. We're done buying from you entirely. We've established relationships with suppliers in Cheyenne who'll give us better prices without trying to murder us. You can't do this. I'll sue for breach of contract." "There is no contract, Mr. Anderson. We buy from whoever offers the best terms at fair prices without violence. That's business." Margaret's voice dropped to something cold and absolutely final. "If your men come near any cooperative member again, if they so much as ride past our properties, we'll press charges with the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. We have witnesses who saw them near Bradley's barn. We have Sam's testimony about the attack. And we have money for lawyers, good lawyers." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Oh, and Mr. Anderson? Tom Bradley's barn? We rebuilt it. Bigger than before. Better construction. The cooperative takes care of its own. Something you might have learned if you'd chosen partnership over threats." They rode out of Greystone in silence, but Margaret could feel the shift in how the ranchers looked at her. She wasn't just Sam Thornton's wife anymore, wasn't just the woman who kept their books. She was a leader in her own right, someone who'd faced down violence with courage and emerged stronger. When she returned to the ranch, she found Sam sitting on the porch despite doctor's orders to rest. His color was better, the wound healing clean without infection, thanks to her careful stitching. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Anderson won't trouble us again. The cooperative is switching to Cheyenne suppliers permanently. We'll save an additional 8% on pricing, which more than makes up for slightly longer delivery times." She sat beside him, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. "And I think I finally understand what you meant about partnership making us stronger than we'd be alone." Sam's hand found hers, laced their fingers together with familiar comfort. "You led them better than I could have in that situation. They'll follow you now, not just tolerate you because you're my wife or because your numbers are good. They'll follow because you proved yourself when it mattered most. "We're partners," Margaret said simply. "When you fall, I stand. That's what it means." They sat in the autumn sunlight, hands clasped, the ranch quiet around them. They'd survived Anderson's violence, survived Sam's injury, survived the test of whether their partnership was built on solid ground or wishful thinking. It was solid. Margaret had proved that beyond any doubt. And in proving it, she'd become something her mother never had the chance to be. A woman who led not despite her gender, but because of her competence, in a community that had learned to value results over convention. Winter came again, but this winter brought changes neither had anticipated. In February, exactly 1 year after the blizzard that had brought her to Wyoming, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. In February, exactly 1 year after the blizzard that had brought her to Wyoming, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. She told Sam while they were mending fence in the south pasture, the same place where he'd been attacked months before. "You're certain?" His hand stilled on the wire he'd been stringing. 3 months along, according to my calculations. The baby should come in July." She watched his face carefully, uncertain how he'd receive news they'd never explicitly discussed wanting. Sam set down his tools and pulled her close, his embrace gentle despite his strength. "Rachel, if it's a girl, could we name her Rachel, after both your mother and mine?" Margaret's throat tightened. "Rachel Margaret Thornton. Yes, that's perfect." The pregnancy was difficult. Margaret worked until she couldn't, then supervised from the porch while Sam hired temporary hands to manage what she couldn't. The cooperative continued to thrive under her management, members bringing business questions to her even when she was 8 months pregnant and uncomfortable. Rachel Margaret Thornton was born on July 23, 1886, during a late summer thunderstorm that reminded Margaret of the blizzard that had started everything. Martha Chen served as midwife, while Sam paced the cabin like a caged animal until he heard his daughter's first cry. "She's perfect," Margaret whispered, counting tiny fingers and toes with wonder. 10 of everything. "Just like her mother," Sam said, touching Rachel's dark hair with reverent gentleness. 5 years later, the ranch had transformed beyond recognition. Rachel Margaret, now 4, could already count to 100 and add single-digit numbers faster than most adults. She followed her mother everywhere, asking endless questions about why numbers worked the way they did, why sheep produced wool, why the seasons changed. Her brother Thomas, 2 years old, was quieter, more interested in animals than arithmetic. He shadowed Sam around the ranch, mimicking his father's careful movements, learning through observation rather than questions. "Mama, if we have 40 sheep and each one makes 10 pounds of wool, how much wool is that?" Rachel asked one autumn evening while Margaret updated the ledgers. "You tell me. You know how to multiply." Rachel's face scrunched in concentration. 4 times 10 is 40, so 40 times 10 is 400 pounds. "Exactly right." Margaret pulled her daughter onto her lap. "Would you like to learn how to write it in the ledger?" From the doorway, Sam watched his wife teaching their daughter mathematics while their son played with wooden horses Sam had carved. The ranch now ran 40 sheep and 25 cattle. The wool operation produced 380 pounds annually, all sold to Boston Textile at premium prices. The cooperative had expanded to 23 member ranches. They'd built something real, something that would last beyond their own lives. 18 years later, on a crisp autumn day in 1904, Rachel Thornton stood before the Wyoming Territorial Board of Accountancy and received her certification as the territory's first female licensed accountant. She was 18 years old, poised and confident. Rachel Thornton stood before the Wyoming Territorial Board of Accountancy and received her certification as the territory's first female licensed accountant. She was 18 years old, poised and confident, wearing a dress her mother had made and carrying a leather satchel that held the same mathematical precision Margaret had brought from Boston 2 decades earlier. "I hereby certify Rachel Margaret Thornton as qualified to practice accounting in Wyoming Territory," the board chairman announced. "Her examination scores were the highest we've recorded in 5 years, regardless of gender." Margaret, watching from the gallery, felt tears she didn't bother to hide. This was what they'd fought for. Not just prosperity, but possibility. The chance for their daughter to be everything Margaret's mother had been denied the opportunity to become. Rachel now managed books for 7 ranches in addition to Thornton Ranch. At family dinners, she and Margaret discussed complex financial strategies, while Sam and Thomas, now 16, talked about breeding stock and weather patterns. The partnership had expanded across generations. But time, which had been kind to their enterprise, was less generous with their bodies. In the winter of 1924, Samuel Thornton caught pneumonia while checking cattle during a late-season blizzard. He was 72 years old, his body worn down by decades of hard labor in brutal conditions. Margaret nursed him for 2 weeks, but on a clear February morning, the same month she'd nearly frozen 40 years earlier, Sam slipped away in the bed they'd shared for 38 years of legal marriage. His last words were characteristically practical. "Books are in order, ranch is paid off. Rachel and Thomas know everything. You'll be fine without me." "I'll manage," Margaret whispered, holding his hand as his breathing slowed and finally stopped. "Just like I always have. But I'll miss you anyway." She was 70 years old, her hair white, her hands gnarled with arthritis, but her mind remained as sharp as the day she'd corrected Edgar Whitmore's ledgers and changed her entire life. Margaret lived 5 more years, teaching her 4 grandchildren the principles she'd learned through hard experience. Honesty over sentiment, competence over pretense, partnership over romance. She died peacefully in her sleep in 1929, 75 years old, in the loft where she'd first found refuge from the storm. 25 years after that, in the summer of 1954, Rachel Thornton Bradley, now 70 herself and a grandmother twice over, sat on the porch of Thornton Ranch with her granddaughter, also named Margaret. "Tell me again how great-grandmother came to Wyoming," little Margaret asked, 7 years old, and already showing signs of the family's mathematical gift. Rachel pulled the girl close and began the story their family had told for 3 generations. It started in 1885, with a blizzard and a stubborn woman who refused to be small. The ranch still stood, larger now, managed by Thomas's grandson with the same careful attention to detail Sam Thornton had taught his children. The cooperative Margaret had founded now served 112 farms and ranches across 5 counties. The wool operation had evolved into a regional textile cooperative employing 300 people. But what endured most powerfully was the lesson Margaret Chen Thornton had taught through the way she lived. That partnership built on honesty and mutual respect could weather any storm, could build something that lasted longer than passion, could create a legacy measured not in romance but in real, tangible good. On the ridge above the ranch house, 2 headstones stood side by side, weathered now but carefully maintained. Samuel Thornton, 1852 to 1924, he valued truth over comfort. Margaret Chen Thornton, 1854 to 1929. They said she was too stubborn, she built an empire anyway. Every year, on the anniversary of the storm, the family gathered at those stones and told the story again. Not a fairy tale about love conquering all, but something truer, a story about 2 practical people who'd built a life on honesty rather than romance, on partnership rather than passion, and discovered that what they created together was stronger than anything either could have built alone. A storm brought her here. Competence made her stay. Honesty built everything worth keeping. That was the legacy that endured. And for 4 generations of Thorntons who'd learned to value substance over sentiment, it was more than enough. It was everything.